Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Lewis Cipher, and this is the Devil's Advocate Debate Club. Welcome back. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about the subject of rights for children, and it's been on my mind recently because of a story I brought up in my last video. I think I brought it up in my last video about a 7-year-old child, a biological male, whose mother claims that he's female. Come back, fishy. And whose father says that he's not, in fact, trans and should continue associating as a little boy. Now, they're divorced, and there's an ongoing custody battle for James/Luna, the individual in question. Currently, the update I most recently heard, the fish ran away from their food rather than coming. I guess they're camera shy. Normally they come right to me. Anyway, though, in the ongoing custody battle, currently speaking, they have been granted shared custody, as I understand, which means that both parents would have to sign off on any major life-altering decision, such as puberty blockers going forward, meaning that if the dad doesn't sign off on it, little James will continue to be raised, at least in his dad's side, as a boy without any major changes on the mom's side. Now, there's a Institute for Medical Change which has suggested that James be sent to them for therapy and potentially surgery, but of course, this is how they make a living. This is literally what they get paid to do, so they would have every reason, of course, to support every potential transition that they could come across. But it brings into question, how does the child feel about all of this, and should we care since the child is 7? Now, of course, we should care in the sense that we should care about the emotional state of the child, but not necessarily in that we should be allowing a child to make life-altering decisions. So let's talk about some life-altering decisions you can't make until a certain age and whether or not those ages are in fact arbitrary. Of course, a big one that comes to mind is alcohol and certain drug use, which in America you can't do until you're 21. In Japan, I know the drinking age is 20, or was the last time I checked at least, and it differs from place to place, being as low as, I think, 14, maybe even 12 in some countries. There might even be countries that don't have a specific drinking age. I'm not sure. Regardless, though, the reason why we don't allow children to have alcohol is for their own protection. Alcohol is bad for anybody, but the way it affects your brain when it's developing and the addictions that can follow is much, much different than the way it affects a fully developed brain. So when does your brain finish developing? Well, it's pretty much when you finish puberty, which is different for each person. For men, on average, it's around 24 that they actually finish fully developing, and for women, it's about 21, which might be where the age came from in America for drinking, is that it is in fact designed to fully protect women and to mostly protect men. Now, abolitionist movements and even restrictionist movements like this have been shown to have little, if any, impact. I mean, underage and teen drinking statistics show that percentage-wise, not just in the numbers, it has actually gone up since states and eventually the nation started implementing these age restrictions. So, while I don't think that that's the reason it's gone up, I certainly don't think that these restrictions have actually stopped young people from drinking. I think what stops young people from drinking is education about the health concerns of drinking, as well as, I guess, counseling, and not necessarily counseling, but help where needed to be an emotional state to care about themselves enough to care what they're doing to their body and their future. Because there are a lot of young people these days, and I was one of them, who simply don't. And, here we go again with the potential sexism. People like to talk about things being equal. Well, the age being set at 21 means it's set to the female standard, meaning that men can legally start drinking several years before the average man's brain will be fully developed, leading to, I would say, a higher potential for alcoholic addiction among men than women due to the legal standard in the United States. Were it set to 24, it would then be fair for the men, in the fact that they would be, no longer disadvantaged. However, women would then have to wait several years after, on average, they were actually ready to start drinking, or as ready as you're going to be. And so unless we set the standards, literally as different for men and women because of our biological differences, and this would mean that trans people would have to follow the drinking age of their sex, not their gender, because there are certain things that still affect you that way. It would literally mean setting a law where things were different for women and for men, like the drinking age for 21 and 24, and probably for a lot of other drugs as well. But this is the path that leads us to not letting black people buy sunscreen, because why would they need to? And I don't think any of us want to go down it. So, where do we set these ages? Well, 21 actually isn't necessarily unfair, since, again, setting the age higher isn't going to stop younger people from stopping drinking. And adulthood is basically set at 18 or 21, depending on how you look at it. So, there's certainly a reason for not allowing people to make life-altering decisions until they're mature. Even decisions like getting married, which you can't make until you're 18, it could be argued should be pushed a little bit further out when you're actually ready to make these changes to your life with full understanding of what they entail. And, given that 24 and 21 are averages for men and women, that means that some people won't reach maturity until much later in life, or at least a bit later. So perhaps 30, when almost everyone would have reached maturity on either side, would be a better arbitrary age for adulthood and all of the things it entails to come along with it. A couple problems with that. One is if we set, say, the age for marriage at 30 and started suggesting to people that they not have children or families until then, this would have a staggering effect on our reproductive rates as a country and society in a very, very negative way. Because quite honestly, biologically and socially, humans should, or not necessarily should, but are generally a little bit better off if they're starting families by that age, if not a little bit earlier. Starting in your 30s is not necessarily starting late, but, well, that being said, as I reached 30, I definitely, in the years coming up to it, gained a lot of perspective that I didn't have as a child, and certainly think that 30 is probably about when I grew up, so to speak. But it's hard to tell. And setting the age at 30, again, well, people already, for the most part, ignore a lot of these restrictions when it comes to the drugs and sex and other things. So, there isn't really a reason to change them from where they are, other than the reason that they were kind of set there arbitrarily, and now people are pushing towards giving kids more choice. If you put a kid on puberty blockers, it changes them forever. In a very short period of time, it will cause them to be unable to reproduce at any point in the future. And, allowing them to transition at a young age obviously has lots of life-changing implications as well. Much more than letting them have a beer here and there would. They'd probably get addicted to alcohol and have life-impacting changes in that, but ones that certainly with willpower and counseling and just good old help from your friends and family can be overcome. So, giving alcohol to kids is, I'm not going to say less damaging, but certainly less life-altering than allowing them to transition. Heck, allowing children to get married is something you can get divorced. You can get out of it in the future. There are paths to escape, but once you've made some of these changes to your body, your brain, and your bodily chemistry, there's literally no going back. So if we're arguing that kids should be able to make these decisions for themselves, then really the argument extends to allowing them to make a lot more decisions for themselves, all of the decisions for themselves. In fact, this would be an argument for taking away age restrictions on any sort of decision, and I think that is a dangerous, horrifying reality that none of us want to live in. Now, the reality is that some people reach physical, mental, and emotional maturity much faster than others. Girls mature faster than boys, and so there are girls reaching their maturity, a good 5 years shy of when they'll legally be able to enjoy it, which it could be argued isn't fair to them. There are boys who hit the drinking age who, maybe are maturing a little slower even than the average boy, who hit the drinking age a good 5-10 years shy of when they finish maturity, leading to an increase in addiction and alcohol in men that we haven't seen the same in women. And it's interesting, opioids, which are less affected by age in the addictive process, they addict you about the same way at any age. It is a crisis that people talk about in America, and it definitely statistically affects women more than men. So I think both sexes have their individual addiction crises, and that we should be looking into exactly why that is. I don't know why for opioids in women, other than potentially the housewife mentality, basically taking painkillers out to kill the pain of boredom. But for alcohol in men, there are quite a few factors, but I think it could be a bigger one than people realize, that the drinking age hits before they hit maturity. So it can be argued as unfair both ways, and maybe at a point in time when we can put someone through like a CAT scan style test to see if they've hit mental and physical maturity. I guess you can't search for emotional or mental maturity, but you could see if their brain and body and biochemistry had fully finished maturing, then potentially having set ages but exceptions for people who went through some kind of testing process to prove their maturity. I mean, emancipation kind of exists for that in some extreme cases, I suppose. But this would be, I would hope, a little bit more thorough and biological in nature than that. And then, I suppose we could set everyone's drinking age and all that to their actual biology and maturity. Though not everyone, I think, would be able to afford or would choose to get the test. Not everyone would want to. So maybe having arbitrary ages set as they are for things to stand, but like I said, with some sort of exception option, that seems like a system which is impossible, expensive, which would benefit the rich over the poor because they would be able to afford the exceptions at a much higher rate, just like many new technologies do, but which might actually be a little bit more fair, and which is addresses the growing concern and question of how many rights should our children have, because they voted to push the voting age down to 16 in Scotland. I forget if it passed or not. I think it did. And the lower you vote the voting age, I mean, those kids are going to vote for younger kids to vote, because the younger you are, the more mature people close to your age group seem. And there's been talk from, a university professor in at least one case of lowering it as low as 6, at which point we're basically saying as soon as kids can read and write, they can vote. And voting is another one of those things that I think is tied to adulthood and to the maturation process, the way that, not quite the same age, but the way that drinking and other things are, for very good reasons. I think that you should be old enough to be informed about the bigger picture and to have some life experience moving forward, looking at the issues before you just start punching in numbers because you think A's look cooler than B's and you hate B's and C's, so you're going to vote A on every ballot measure because, cool, A. I know they're not always labeled A, B, C, but you get my point. Kids will do the darndest things. I don't necessarily want them doing them in the voting booth, in bars, like the trans kid who strip teases in gay bars from time to time. Places where children aren't normally allowed, but they make an exception for him so that he can come in and show off his trans pride for a bunch of gay men. I just don't think that kids necessarily need to be put into these positions. And hey, if we had some kind of exception system, you go through a test, it turns out that by 8 years old you had completely physically and, at least your brain structure had completely matured, and you go through a emotional test and you seem to be fully emotionally mature, that just doesn't happen. Or it's 1 in a billion. And yeah, we've got 6-7 billion people on this world, so technically speaking, there are people who the system isn't going to be fair for no matter what, because people are far too individual and unique to build a system that will function equally for all of them without having some rule in place that allows for individualized exceptions. And again, that causes all kinds of problems and continues the breakdown and continues the gap between the classes, as it would, once again, basically just benefit the people, at least initially, who could afford it. But technologies eventually become cheaper, and it could eventually become a standard practice to, have you tested, have the age at which you would mature guessed when you're quite young, and then once you start approaching it, take yearly tests to see when you get there. That sounds like a system that would be, if not more fair, at least less arbitrary than the one that we have. And, it's a subject I kind of don't want to touch, but really intend to do a video on at some point. It's scary to see the maps or minor attracted people, the community, come off of Tumblr and onto Twitter, which has made a lot more people aware of them, or at least aware of their numbers, and they're fighting for rights in the LGBTQ community because Q means queer, and queer is just different. So if your sexual practices are deviant or not normal, which there's definitely are, you classify, at least in the dictionary sense, as Q. So there's a reason why, maybe even a logical reason, now that the LGBTQ community has built themselves the way they have, that these people are arguing for rights within that community. The next step for them after that will be to argue what I just have, that a lot of these ages are arbitrary, that people reach maturity at different rates, and that the current system needs to be readdressed. I think that it's potentially currently an unfair system that could even be argued as sexist against men or women, the way it's currently structured, depending on your perspective. However, I think that any restructuring that happens should be done with the utmost care to protect children, people who, at whatever age, have not reached this level of maturity. And, for autistic and learning disabled people, this might mean into their 40s and 50s they can't have alcohol. But I think we should do whatever we can to protect children from the people who would like to see them become adults too soon. Anyway, I think it's scary that we have a 10-year-old kid stripping for gay men. And this is somehow acceptable with about 6 to 10% of the population. I don't think that it's okay that a 7-year-old should choose to have a gender change operation, because I don't think that a 7-year-old, unless they've had a extremely early and rapid pace puberty that would put them as probably some kind of medical mystery, and which they should probably be studied to learn more about the effects of rapid onset puberty. With the exception of cases that I just don't think exist, I don't think we should be letting kids make life-altering decisions. And you can argue that what constitutes a kid is different for different nations, it's different for different groups of people, that scientifically there isn't necessarily consensus. But I think a 7-year-old's a kid. And I think it's probably for the best that it sounds like this transition won't be happening. But hey, that's just my opinion. I've got a lot more to say on this subject, but the video has already gone longer than I expected, and I think I'll let you guys go before I get any more emotional. I hope you've enjoyed the fish. I know you humans need to be reminded to like and subscribe. I'm working on a video that will be kind of an open letter to Christian Weston Chandler, Chris Chan. I don't think I'll actually be scripting it for a couple of reasons, but I'd like to get that one done, and let me know what you think in the comments below, because I think this could be one of the most important subjects that we face as a society coming into the modern age, as the taboo edges of our society in the information age are able to connect with each other in a way that in previous eras they couldn't, allowing them to push for rights that in a lot of cases I just don't think we want to give them. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I'm your host, Lewis Cipher. Thank you for watching the Devil's Advocate Debate Club.